Lagos moved on, as cities do, swallowing old scandals and birthing new ones. But for Buki, life after her 18th birthday felt like walking with one foot in light and the other in a shadow that refused to loosen its grip, as if the past, though defeated, still lingered in the corners of rooms, in the edges of memory, in the quiet moments just before sleep. She threw herself into her studies, into the dream that had once lived small inside her chest, studying law with a fierceness that startled even her lecturers, because she knew better than anyone how justice can tremble on thin legs unless someone brave enough steadies it. And as she excelled, winning debates, publishing papers, receiving invitations to speak at youth conferences, Chief Okafo watched her with a mixture of pride and awe, marveling at how a child who once hid behind storeroom doors had grown into a young woman whose voice could command a room. Yet beneath all the joy and promise, a question lived quietly inside him like a bird that refused to fly away. Would the shadows of the past ever truly die? One afternoon, months after she gained admission to the university, a letter arrived at the mansion, a brown, wrinkled envelope stamped with the seal of Kirikiri Women's Correctional Center. And when the driver delivered it to Chief's study, he stared at the handwriting for a long time, recognizing it instantly as Vivian's. And though part of him wanted to tear it up and throw it away, another part pushed him to open it, to confront whatever ghost she had sent. The letter was short, written in shaky, slanted pen, and it began not with accusations or rage, but with a sentence that pulled him back into memories he had tried to bury. "I have had too much time to think." She wrote of loneliness, of cold cement floors, of nights when rain leaked through cracks in the ceiling and reminded her of the life she had destroyed with her own hands. She wrote of how imprisonment had stripped her of everything: jewelry, status, wigs, friends who once sipped champagne with her but vanished the moment the trial ended, and how regret had started as a flicker then grown into a flame that kept her awake, burning away the pride she once held like armor. Yes, she confessed, she had hated him for wanting another wife, hated herself for failing to give him a child, hated the whispering relatives, the pitiful eyes of church women, the fear that she was dispensable. And in that hatred she chose destruction instead of healing, a choice that led her to become the architect of her own downfall. But what surprised him most was the final part of her letter, where she spoke of Buki, not with venom as in the past, but with something almost like reluctant respect, as she wrote, "If not for that child, my hands would be stained with murder instead of attempted murder. She saved you, but she also saved whatever is left of my soul, because if I had succeeded, I would have carried that blood into my grave, and God would not forgive me." She ended with a plea that unsettled him deeply. "I know I cannot leave this place soon, but if you ever bring the girl to see me, even once, I will carry the weight of your forgiveness for the rest of my life." Chief folded the letter slowly, exhaling long and trembling, then called for Buki that evening when the sky softened into purple and the garden lights flickered on, casting gentle halos on the hibiscus bushes, and when she entered the study, he handed her the letter wordlessly. She read it in silence, her eyebrows tightening, her breath hitching, because even though Vivian had tried to kill the man she now called father, even though the woman had once sneered at her existence, a part of Buki felt a strange ache. Perhaps not for Vivian the woman, but for Vivian the broken shadow trapped behind bars of her own making. For days afterward, the letter hung over her like a cloud, heavy but not dark. And she found herself wondering whether true freedom required not only speaking truth in the face of evil, but facing the remains of that evil with the grace that comes from survival. One Saturday morning, she made her decision, standing before Chief with calm determination. "Daddy, I want to see her," she said, and though he hesitated, he saw the strength in her eyes, the same strength that once dragged courage out of a terrified 9-year-old, and he nodded. The drive to Kirikiri felt unreal, the city blurring past in waves of yellow buses, street hawkers, and dust, until the prison gates rose before them like a steel reminder that choices build cages faster than walls do. And when Buki stepped into the visitation room, her heart thudded painfully because Vivian was no longer the regal woman in gold jewelry and silk wrappers, but a small figure in a faded uniform, her hair short, her face lined, her pride gone. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Vivian whispered, "You came," her voice a fragile thread unraveling in the air, and Buki, steady despite the tremor in her limbs, replied, "Yes, I came." What passed between them in that conversation would mark them both forever. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. An acknowledgement that though their lives were woven by conflict, they were tied forever by a moment of truth that neither could escape. Vivian apologized, not grandly but honestly, tears slipping down her cheeks as she said, "I was blind, and you saw everything. I hated you for your smallness, but your smallness became my downfall, and your courage became your crown." Buki listened quietly, feeling the last ghost of fear melt out of her bones, and when she finally stood to leave, she said softly, "You were wrong, but prison is punishment enough. I hope you find peace here someday." Outside the prison, the sunlight felt warmer, the air cleaner, the world wider, and Chief, watching her walk toward the car with her chin lifted, knew then that she had crossed a threshold that even adulthood could not guarantee. A threshold of compassion, the kind that grows only in those who have walked through darkness and refused to become it. In the years that followed, Buki became a lawyer known across Lagos, not just for her brilliance but for her refusal to let poor children be invisible, using her story in schools, courts, and communities as proof that courage does not begin with strength, but with a whisper that refuses to die. And though life moved forward, she carried her past not as a wound but as a lantern, lighting her path and the paths of those who followed. And whenever the shadow of what had almost happened tried to rise again, she remembered the storeroom door, the crack through which truth leaked, and the voice that once trembled but spoke anyway. And she smiled, knowing she had become not just the child who knew too much, but the woman who used that knowledge to change the world. In the years that followed, Lagos never stopped moving, cars rushing like restless thoughts, markets roaring like hungry oceans, skyscrapers rising with ambitions taller than truth. But somewhere within its endless pulse, a quiet legend began to grow, a story told in whispers at school assemblies, murmured during church youth meetings, shared by mothers plaiting their daughters' hair at night. The story of a girl who once saw death through a storeroom crack and grew into a woman whose voice made even powerful men sit up straighter. Buki, now known across the state as Barrister Bukola Okafo, walked through the world with a blend of humility and fire, the kind that made people wonder how someone so gentle could hold so much steel inside her. And though she stood in courtrooms wearing elegant black robes and speaking legal grammar that twisted the tongues of the unprepared, she never forgot the girl who once cleaned floors with her mother, nor the small mat she slept on, nor the nights she cried into a doll whose single remaining eye saw all her fears. Perhaps that was why she fought so fiercely for the children no one saw, those who lived in cramped rooms behind mansions, those who trailed behind their mothers at market stalls, those whose voices were swallowed by poverty long before they learned to read. She visited public schools where the ceilings leaked and the chalk dust clung to her clothes. She sat on broken benches, listening to children tell her about bullies, abusive guardians, hunger, lost futures, and she made them all a promise. Your voice matters, even if no one listens yet, and her words spread like seeds, taking root in small hearts that had never before been watered with hope. But destiny, once awakened, rarely stops unfolding, and one day, when she was 25 and already a rising star in human rights cases, an invitation arrived sealed with the emblem of the Lagos state government, calling her to a special ceremony at the Civic Center, where she was to be honored with the Governor's Medal of Courage for her childhood bravery and her legal work protecting vulnerable children. And though she smiled politely, the weight of that honor pressed gently on her chest, not with pride, but with gratitude for the path God had carved for her through danger, fear, and unlikely grace. The night of the ceremony, the hall glittered with chandeliers and journalists, the air thick with perfume, power, and camera flashes. And as Buki stepped onto the stage in a beautifully tailored dress that made her look like the best version of every dream she had ever dared, the applause rose like a wave. But even as she smiled and shook hands, her eyes occasionally drifted to the audience, where Chief Daddy, sat wiping tears with a handkerchief he pretended was for the heat. His chest swelling with a pride so large it softened the lines time had carved into his face. When it was time for her speech, the hall quieted, the cameras pointed. The lights dimmed except for a golden beam shining on her like destiny had placed it there, and she began not with stories of her achievements or education, but with the memory that had shaped her life. "I was once a child nobody saw," she said, her voice steady but soft, carrying across the hall like a song people leaned forward to hear. "But I saw something no one else did, and I spoke because someone had first spoken kindness to me." She continued, "Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it trembles, but it still chooses truth." And as she spoke, the room changed, the energy shifted, and even politicians known for iron faces blinked slowly, touched by the sincerity in her voice. She ended by dedicating the award to every child whose voice had ever been dismissed, buried, ignored, reminding them that invisibility was not destiny. It was only a temporary shadow waiting for light. After the ceremony, photographs were taken, interviews were conducted, strangers shook her hand. But when she finally got home late that night, exhausted and exhilarated, her house, felt strangely quiet. And in the hallway where she once walked barefoot, carrying plates for guests who never saw her, she paused, feeling a tug in her spirit, a memory, a call. Without thinking, she walked to Chief's old study, now preserved as a small memorial since his passing 2 years earlier from natural causes, and entered, breathing in the familiar scent of leather, paper, and the faint cologne he used to wear. His framed picture sat on the desk, smiling that warm smile that once gave a scared girl the courage to run toward truth instead of away from it. And she sat in his old chair, letting tears slip silently as she whispered, "Daddy, I hope you're proud of me," knowing in her heart he would have stood, clapped, and shouted her name the loudest. Outside, the wind rustled through the garden, the same garden where she once hid behind hibiscus bushes, crying helplessly for a man she could not save, yet did save. And the leaves whispered back as if answering her prayer. Days later, Buki visited the prison one last time. Not because she owed Vivian anything, but because stories deserve endings, even painful ones. When she walked into the visitation room, she found Vivian older, thinner, her once sharp eyes dulled by years of regret. But when she saw Buki, a flicker of something, perhaps relief, lit briefly in her gaze. They spoke little, mostly sitting in an understanding that words no longer needed to bridge. And as Buki stood to leave, Vivian whispered, "Your kindness freed me more than any court ever did." And for the first time, Buki believed that even broken people might find redemption if someone dared to face them without hate. Stepping out of the prison gates into blazing sunlight, she felt something lift from her shoulders, something that had followed her since childhood, a shadow that finally knew it no longer belonged to her. And so the story of Buki, the girl who knew too much, the woman who used that knowledge to change lives, became more than a tale told in Lagos. It became a quiet anthem passed from child to child, a reminder that even in a world loud with power, wealth, and secrets, there is still space for small voices to grow mighty, for courage to bloom in unlikely hearts, and for invisible children to rise into futures so bright that even shadows bow in their presence. Years rolled forward like a river gaining confidence, and as Lagos rose higher with new bridges, louder markets, brighter screens, and faster dreams, Buki's influence began to stretch far beyond courtroom walls, carrying her name into villages that had never known electricity, into cramped classrooms where chalk dust floated like hopeful snow, into the hearts of children who had once believed silence was their only inheritance. By the time she turned 30, Barrister Bukola Okafo had become more than a woman. She was a movement, a symbol, a story whispered in places where hope rarely lingered. And it was in this burning desire to give back that she founded the Seen Child Foundation, a sprawling initiative designed to protect children from the shadows she herself once lived in, offering legal aid, scholarships, mentorship, shelter for abused minors, and a hotline staffed day and night by volunteers trained to listen to the trembling voices of the unseen. Within a year, the Foundation's bright yellow buses bearing the slogan, "Every child deserves to be seen," roamed through rural communities, picking up children for free after-school programs, delivering food packs to struggling families, and offering workshops that taught parents and teachers how to spot signs of abuse, exploitation, or fear. One child at a time, she was stitching together a future she once thought impossible. Yet growth came with challenges, for as her foundation gained recognition, it also attracted the attention of politicians eager to use her for their own gain. Business moguls offering hefty donations with hidden clause attached, and criminals who lost money whenever her advocacy disrupted their exploitation pipelines. But Buki, shaped in fire, sharpened by truth, lifted by grace, refused to be owned, bribed, or intimidated. Instead, she used every threat as fuel, every challenge as a stepping stone, gathering around her a team of lawyers, social workers, journalists, and youth leaders who believed in her mission almost fiercely as she did. And together they built something bigger than a movement. They built a beacon. One day, while reviewing case files late into the night, her eyes softened as she opened a folder labeled Litigation Project, Vivian Okafo, a report on prison outreach programs that her foundation had quietly extended to women behind bars, providing mental health support, literacy classes, and rehabilitation paths for inmates willing to rebuild their shattered stories. Many people asked her why she insisted on helping women like the one who had once tried to destroy her family, but Buki only smiled and said, "Justice is about truth. Restoration is about healing, and I refuse to build a world where forgiveness has no door." But in truth, she also carried an invisible thread connecting her to the past, reminding her that humans can break and still be mended. Under this program, Vivian herself had learned to read fluently, earned a vocational certificate in tailoring, and begun mentoring younger inmates to stay out of violence and crime. The day Buki visited the prison again, years after her last encounter, she found Vivian transformed not physically. Age had carved deeper lines around her eyes, but spiritually, as humility had softened her in ways unimaginable to the woman who once walked across marble floors issuing commands like a queen. And when Vivian saw Buki standing in the visitation hall, she stood with trembling hands, whispering, "I thought you forgot about me," to which Buki replied, "I don't forget chapters, I only choose how they end." And in that moment, something ancient between them dissolved. Weeks later, when Vivian was granted early release for exemplary conduct, she left the prison not to return to her old life, because that life had died the day her greed met a child's courage, but to begin again in a rehabilitation center supported by Buki's foundation, learning that redemption is not owed but earned. Meanwhile, Buki's work continued to ripple across the country. She launched a law fellowship for underprivileged teenagers, partnered with NGOs in Ghana, Kenya, and Rwanda, and in her speeches she reminded governments that societies crumble not from poverty, but from neglecting those too small to fight for themselves. Her name began appearing in newspapers as a potential future minister for youth or education. But she always laughed softly and brushed aside the speculation, saying she preferred building from outside the system rather than navigating its labyrinth of politics. Still, destiny has a way of nudging people toward platforms they never asked for, and soon she was invited to address the African Union Youth Council in Addis Ababa, where she delivered a speech so powerful that delegates sat in stunned silence before erupting into applause, her words echoing across the hall. "The child you refuse to see today may be the leader who saves your nation tomorrow. Invest in them, not when it's convenient, but when it is necessary." And after that speech, her foundation received international funding, doubling its reach within months. But through all the accolades, all the interviews, all the ceremonies, Buki remained startlingly grounded, preferring to sit cross-legged on school floors reading storybooks to children rather than rubbing shoulders with elites. And one evening, as she watched a group of children painting murals outside the foundation's headquarters, bright images of suns, hearts, books, and eyes, she felt an overwhelming fullness swell in her chest. A realization that everything she built was rooted in a moment of terror she could have stayed silent about. That one act of courage had become a river feeding thousands. That being seen wasn't about fame, but about ensuring others no longer disappeared behind closed doors. And as dusk spread across the Lagos sky, streaking it with gold and deep blue, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for every step in her journey. The fear, the hope, the betrayal, the courage, the justice, the forgiveness, knowing that each piece, dark or light, had sculpted the woman she had become. At that moment, a little girl tugged her sleeve and pointed to the mural, asking shyly, "Auntie Buki, can you help me paint the eyes? You said every child should be seen." And Buki laughed softly, dipping her brush into bright yellow paint as she knelt beside the girl, saying, "Yes, because seeing you is how the world begins to change." And in that simple act, paintbrush touching wall, light touching shadow, a remembered child guiding a child still learning her voice, the legacy she built continued, not in awards or headlines, but in the quiet miracle of visibility, passed from one heart to another until the whole world began to see. As the sun of her 30s warmed into the gentler gold of her early 40s, Buki began to witness something extraordinary, something even greater than the foundation she built, greater than the awards, greater than the government invitations, and the international recognition. She began to see her light carried forward by children who had once been invisible, children who now stood boldly in the center of their own stories, lighting corners she herself could not reach. And it happened quietly at first, like sparks flickering in the dark. One day, a teenage boy named Timi, who had grown up in a broken home and once stuttered whenever he spoke to adults, stood on a wooden platform in Bariga and addressed a group of parents about child abuse laws, his voice steady, his posture firm, explaining rights he had learned from the Foundation's free Saturday classes. Another day, a shy girl named Ebi, rescued from domestic servitude by one of Buki's outreach teams, wrote an article titled "The Courage to Speak" that went viral across the country, inspiring schools to create anonymous reporting systems. And then there was young Musa from Maiduguri, whose father had been swallowed by insurgency and whose mother sold vegetables by the roadside. He recorded a video on his mother's borrowed phone teaching children how to identify manipulation from predatory adults. And somehow the video reached 1 million views, turning Musa into a youth advocate before he even realized what advocacy meant. Buki watched all this unfold like a mother watching seeds she planted long ago bloom in unexpected colors. And one evening, as she sat on the balcony of the Foundation headquarters overlooking the Lagos Lagoon, she realized that her mission had transformed into a sweeping tide carried by countless hands, hearts, and voices. Hers was no longer the only light, but with growth came new threats. For whenever youth become aware and empowered, systems built on silence tremble. And soon Buki found herself standing against new shadows, rings of child traffickers disguising themselves as scholarship programs, corrupt officials diverting funds meant for school feeding, and powerful families trying to bury cases involving their privileged children, harming less privileged ones. Though tired at times, she never backed down, never lowered her voice, never walked away, because she remembered the storeroom, the crack in the wood, the truth she'd once whispered to a policeman when her legs trembled so violently she could barely stand. And if she had found courage then, she could find it now. But life, in its quiet wisdom, began reminding her that every hero eventually needs someone to carry them too. During a heated trial involving a politician accused of child exploitation, Buki fainted in court from exhaustion, her body finally rebelling after years of sleepless nights and endless battles. And when she opened her eyes in a hospital room, she found herself surrounded not by doctors alone, but by a group of teenagers, now young adults, who had grown under her mentorship, Timi, Ebi, Musa, and dozens more, holding hands in a protective circle, their eyes shining not with fear, but with fierce loyalty. "Auntie Buki," Timi said gently, "we can handle some of these fights now. You don't have to carry everything anymore." And for the first time in her life, she felt the weight on her shoulders shift, shared among many, and she allowed herself to rest. After her recovery, she returned to the Foundation in a different way, not as the single driving force, but as a guide, a strategist, a visionary shaping the direction while the youth-led teams executed the work with passion and competence. She often sat with them in roundtable meetings, listening to ideas so brilliant she wished she had possessed half their confidence at their age. and she realized that true leadership wasn't about standing in front, but about lifting others until they could walk ahead of you. Then came the day that confirmed her legacy more deeply than any honor could, when the United Nations sent an invitation requesting her presence in Geneva. Not as a guest, but as a keynote speaker for the Global Summit on Children's Rights. And as she stepped onto the grand stage with flags from 100 nations behind her, she spoke not of herself, but of the children who had risen from shadows, her voice carrying across the hall with the certainty of someone who had lived her message. Protecting a child is not charity, it is survival. Because every society, every nation, every generation stands fragile until its smallest members stand strong. The applause that followed felt like thunder echoing through mountains. Yet still, when she returned home to Lagos weeks later, she insisted on checking homework assignments at the Foundation's after-school program before doing anything else, smiling as children complained about math or fought over crayons, because these moments grounded her more than accolades ever could. But destiny had one more circle to complete, one that tugged gently at her soul. She felt it the day she received a call from the rehabilitation center. Vivian had fallen ill, her health deteriorating due to complications from years of stress and untreated conditions in prison. Despite everything, Buki visited. She found Vivian in a quiet hospice room, wrapped in a soft blanket, her breathing shallow, yet peaceful, her eyes clearer than they had ever been outside prison walls. When she saw Buki, she managed a weak smile and whispered, "I heard everything you've done. You turned your pain into purpose. I am proud of you, even if my part in your story was the darkness." And Buki took her hand gently, replying, "Every story needs contrast to reveal its light." And a single tear slipped down Vivian's cheek as she closed her eyes for the last time, her fingers softening around Buki's, leaving behind a silence that felt like forgiveness finally released into the air. Months later, during a memorial gathering at the Foundation, Buki told her youth leaders, "Pain is not meant to be inherited, it's meant to be transformed." And they nodded, understanding her more deeply than words could say. In time, as Buki walked through the world with silver threading into her hair and deeper wisdom threading into her soul, she watched her protégés represent the Foundation at conferences, lead rescue missions, win court cases, and change laws. And she realized she had become something bigger than a symbol. She had become the beginning of a legacy fueled not by fear, but by defiance against silence. And whenever people asked her how she built such a powerful movement, she always smiled and answered softly, "It started with a child who was afraid, but spoke anyway." Because that truth, more than anything else, was the flame now burning in countless hearts, carried by children who had once lived in darkness, but now shone so brightly that the shadows themselves began to disappear. By the time Bukola Okafo stepped into her 50s, the world around her no longer resembled the one she had grown up in. Lagos had changed, Nigeria had shifted, and in ways both subtle and seismic, the entire continent felt different. Because a movement that started with a frightened 9-year-old whispering truth into a policeman's uniform had grown into a continental force that rewrote policies, reshaped laws, and rekindled hope in places long forgotten by power. Her foundation had expanded far beyond its yellow buses and early outreach missions, now operating in 12 countries, with youth-led branches in Accra, Nairobi, Kigali, Johannesburg, and Dakar, each one pulsing with the energy of children who had once been invisible, but now stood tall as advocates, educators, and protectors of those still trapped where they once were. International organizations sought her guidance, universities invited her as a visiting lecturer, and documentaries were made about her journey. Yet none of this changed her daily routine, which always began the same. She woke before dawn, prayed quietly, reviewed the day's cases, and walked barefoot for a few minutes in her garden, grounding herself in humility, remembering the storeroom, the girl she once was, and the man who gave her a future. But as the world praised her, shadows of new dangers began emerging. For with influence came enemies. Groups who profited from child trafficking intensified threats. Corrupt officials tried to twist her work for political gain, and anonymous messages warned her to stop fighting for reforms that would expose networks built on buried secrets. Still, she continued, her voice sharper, her resolve unbreakable, telling her team if truth threatens them, then truth is working, and her courage rippled outward, strengthening the movement she had nurtured. But destiny, which had been shaping her quietly across decades, had one final calling for her, one that arrived unexpectedly at an African Union summit held in Addis Ababa, where nations gathered to debate a new child protection charter meant to unify the continent under stronger laws. During the heated negotiation, when delegates argued fiercely and progress stalled, a representative from Rwanda stood and said, "Let the woman whose life is living testimony guide this." And suddenly all eyes turned to Buki. Though she had no political power, she had moral power, something rarer, heavier, earned through sacrifice. And when she walked to the podium, the room fell silent. Her speech felt less like words and more like a heartbeat echoing across the hall as she told her story, not with dramatization, but with raw truth, saying, "Children do not need our pity. They need our protection, our laws, and our courage. Because every time a child is silenced, a nation loses a future leader." And as she spoke, leaders who once resisted change shifted in their seats, some swallowing tears, others nodding slowly. And by the end of her address, the entire assembly stood in applause, united in a way never seen before. The charter passed unanimously that afternoon, and newspapers across the continent printed headlines like, "Buki's voice moves Africa," and "The girl who spoke saved a generation." But in her quiet hotel room later that night, Buki simply sat by the window, looking at the dark Ethiopian sky sprinkled with stars, whispering, "Daddy, see what your kindness began." Because she knew she was not the sole author of her story. Chief, Mama Buki, Officer Adelaide, and even Vivian had shaped the path that led her here. Upon returning to Lagos, she found a letter waiting for her, a handwritten note from Musa, the boy who once recorded videos on his mother's phone and was now a human rights journalist, telling her that he and two others she had mentored were forming the Next Voice Initiative, a global coalition of young advocates inspired by her foundation but independent of it, designed to take her work beyond Africa into South America and Southeast Asia. Reading his letter, Buki felt tears fill her eyes, not from sadness or exhaustion, but from the overwhelming realization that her dream had grown legs, wings, and entire generations to carry it. It was then she understood that the truest impact of a life's work is not measured by monuments or medals, but by the number of people who continue the mission long after you step back. And though she remained active, guiding her teams and drafting policies, something within her began shifting gently, like a lamp dimming not from weakness, but because dawn had arrived and the world no longer needed that particular light in the same way. One morning, sitting in the courtyard of the foundation, surrounded by children painting murals and youth leaders coordinating programs, she announced her decision. "In 2 years, I will retire from active leadership." And though gasps filled the air and protests rose, she smiled softly, adding, "A movement is strongest when it can thrive without its founder." And with those words, she initiated a transition that would solidify her legacy forever. But retirement for Buki did not mean silence. Instead, she dedicated herself to writing, documenting stories of children she had encountered, court cases that changed laws, and moments of courage that had shaped her path. Crafting a memoir titled Through the Crack, the story of a seen child, which became a bestseller across Africa, used in schools and universities to teach human rights, ethics, and the power of individual truth. Years later, when she finally stepped down, handing the reins to a new generation of leaders she had trained with love, discipline, and wisdom, the world honored her not with a farewell, but with a promise to continue fighting where she had left off. On the day of her retirement celebration, held in the very mansion where her story began, she walked through halls that once echoed with fear and secrecy, but now rang with laughter, purpose, and transformation. Standing at the garden where she once cried behind hibiscus bushes, she felt a hand squeeze hers. A small child from the foundation, eyes bright, voice soft, asking, "Auntie Buki, how did you become so strong?" And she smiled, kneeling to meet the child's gaze, replying, "Strength is just fear that learned to speak." And the child nodded, absorbing the truth like sunlight. Later, as dusk settled and the call to prayer floated across the neighborhood, Buki stood alone for a moment, letting the golden sky wash over her, feeling the peace of a life fully lived, battles truly fought, and generations forever changed. For the first time since she was 9, she felt no shadow behind her, only light ahead, stretching far beyond her lifetime, carried by countless children who had found their voices, because she once dared to use. In the final stretch of her life, when her hair had turned the soft silver of morning clouds and her steps had slowed into a graceful rhythm shaped by decades of walking through both fire and light, Bukola Okafo found herself living in the quiet peace that only those who fulfilled their purpose ever truly know. She spent her days teaching at universities as a guest lecturer, mentoring young lawyers who came to her not just for legal wisdom, but for spiritual direction. Visiting community centers to read storybooks to children, and walking through the headquarters of her foundation like a proud mother watching her children build legacies of their own. And though the world continued to evolve, technology transforming classrooms, drones replacing field surveys, and global coalitions reshaping law, one thing remained constant: the story of the frightened 9-year-old girl who once whispered truth through fear and grew into a woman who taught nations how to listen. Her memoir became required reading in secondary schools and was adapted into a film that won awards across Africa and Europe, retelling her journey with such raw truth that audiences wept openly. Teachers paused lessons to discuss courage, and children laid their little hands on the screen as if touching her strength would pass something into them. Buki watched these impacts with humility, always saying, "If my life teaches even one child to speak, then it was worth everything." But destiny had written far more than one child into her script. On her 75th birthday, the foundation unveiled its most ambitious initiative yet: the African Center for Child Justice, a research and training institute that combined law, psychology, social work, and youth leadership into one powerhouse. And the building was named the Bukola Okafo Institute for Courage and Justice, its marble plaque carrying the words, "For the child who was once unseen, and for every child yet to be seen." She stood before the plaque in her flowing Ankara gown, her hands trembling slightly as she traced the engraved letters, feeling the weight of her journey stretch full circle around her like a halo of memories. But even legends must one day rest, and when Buki fell ill at 76 with a gentle illness that touched her body but not her spirit, she treated it as she treated everything in life, with grace, acceptance, and a quiet strength that soothed those around her. Her doctors advised extended treatment, her foundation leaders begged her to slow down, and youth she once taught filled her home with flowers, letters, and songs. Yet she only smiled softly and said, "I have lived long, I have lived fully. What more could a woman ask for?" One evening, as dusk melted the Lagos sky into pink and gold, she asked to be taken to the old mansion in Ijai, the place where her destiny was born, and her closest companions drove her there gently, helping her walk through the familiar halls, now transformed into a museum dedicated to her story. She touched the walls, the floorboards, the corner near the storeroom door where she once crouched, terrified at 9 years old, and she whispered, "Thank you for being the beginning." Then walked into the garden she once cried in as a child, and stood before the hibiscus bushes that had witnessed her first prayer for courage. As the wind rustled the petals like old friends calling her name, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, absorbing the scent of earth, memory, and completion. That night, surrounded by her closest family and the youth who had grown into her sons and daughters in purpose, Bukola Okafo passed peacefully in her sleep. Her lips curved in a faint smile, as though she were simply stepping into another chapter written by the same gentle God who held her through every storm. When the news broke the next morning, the world did not mourn quietly. Lagos wept like a city remembering its hero. Radio stations played recordings of her speeches. Television networks ran documentaries, and children across the country wore yellow ribbons in honor of the foundation she built. Thousands gathered at the Civic Center for her memorial, where leaders, activists, scholars, and ordinary children stood shoulder to shoulder, united by the light she had poured into them. And when her coffin, simple, elegant, lined with Ankara fabric, was carried through the crowd, they chanted softly, "She saw us. She saw us. She saw us." At the funeral, a little girl no older than the age Buki once was stood at the podium, representing the youth of the foundation, and in a trembling voice she said, "Auntie Buki told me that fear is just truth waiting to be spoken. I will speak because she taught me how." And her words flowed into the hearts of millions watching from across the continent. After the burial, as the sun dipped low and cast long golden shadows across the earth, the leaders of the foundation unveiled a statue in her honor, Buki standing tall, one hand holding a book, the other extended downward toward a small child lifting their face to hers. Beneath the statue were inscribed the words, "Courage does not begin loud, it begins small, afraid but willing." And though her physical presence was gone, her legacy began to burn brighter than ever. Laws continued changing, children continued speaking, youth continued rising, and her foundation expanded further, reaching refugees in Sudan, street children in Brazil, and underserved schools in India. In classrooms across Africa, teachers told her story with reverence, mothers whispered it to their daughters at night, and police academies taught it as a case study in what one child's bravery could achieve. And so, long after her footprints faded from the floors of the mansion where her life changed, long after her voice no longer echoed through courtrooms or conferences, the world continued moving with a little more compassion, a little more courage, a little more justice. Because a child who was once unseen had lived in a way that forced the world to look. And in the end, that was her greatest victory. The girl who once hid behind a door crack became the woman whose shadow the future could stand inside without fear.